she snapped without even turning her head. "No, you can't sit here." Her voice cut through the cabin like a whip, sharp, dismissive, and loud enough for everyone in first class to hear. "That's my seat," she repeated, gesturing casually without so much as a glance. "I paid for it, probably a lot more than you did." She tugged her cashmere blanket tighter, like it granted her jurisdiction over both chairs. Her legs were crossed comfortably across the armrest of one knee. Her silk pillow rested precisely where someone else's head should have been. When the tall man in the tailor navy suit tried to step past her, she lifted one hand. "No, you're not going to block me from resting," she scoffed, laughing under her breath. "With those cheap tarted clothes, there's no way someone like you has a seat here." Her words spilled out, each more cutting than the last. "All right, okay." Damon Washington's voice was steady, calm, like someone who had been through worse and had long since stopped being surprised. "I'm gonna ignore that, for your sake." He exhaled once, quiet but firm. "I don't feel like being belligerent today. I just want to sit in my seat." But Victoria Sterling didn't budge. She adjusted her recline button, like he wasn't even standing there. "No," she said sharply. "Actually, I'm gonna have you moved." She looked up to flag the flight attendant. "Yep, that's right. He's gonna move back there." She didn't point, but her tone made the direction clear. Somewhere past the curtain, somewhere behind first class. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the glass facade of Falcon Ridge Executive Terminal in Newport City, casting gentle shadows over polished marble floors and gleaming check-in counters. It was just past 6 a.m., and passengers moved briskly through security and lounges, clutching briefcases and double-shot espressos. This wasn't your average airport crowd. This was the weekday lineup for Skyler Airways Flight 1870, its premier cross-country route from Newport to New York. Inside Gate 6A, the atmosphere buzzed with a calm urgency. Executives in bespoke suits filled the lounge. Venture capitalists murmured into Bluetooth headsets. Consultants tapped tablets and exchanged curt nods over oat milk lattes. Everyone was busy. Everyone was important. But none of them noticed what was unfolding just beyond the boarding door, where a black man in a Taylor Tom Ford suit had just been told, flat out, that he didn't belong. Damon didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He didn't call for a supervisor. Instead, he adjusted the strap of his briefcase, glanced once at his boarding pass, and simply waited. Calm, silent, controlled. Victoria Sterling smirked to herself, mistaking his stillness for surrender. What she didn't know, what no one on that plane knew, was that the man she'd just dismissed wasn't just another passenger. He was the reason Skyler Airways existed, and in exactly 7 minutes, he began to quietly shut the entire airline down. Inside the first-class cabin of Skyler Airways Flight 1870, everything gleamed. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner had been turned into a sanctuary of polished surfaces and whispered luxury. Flight attendants moved like dancers across a soft-lit stage, folding coats with crisp efficiency, pouring pre-flight champagne with near-silent precision. The scent of lemon-infused disinfectant mingled with the subtle aroma of vanilla leather. Pillows fluffed, seat back smooth, nothing out of place. But Seat 1D wasn't just occupied, it was conquered. Victoria Sterling lounged across both 1D and 1E like they were stitched for her alone, dressed in an ivory cashmere set with matching Chanel flats and a sand-colored sun hat. She oozed generational wealth. Her silk pillow and lavender blanket had been carefully draped to annex both seats, creating the illusion of a private pod. A collapsible footrest extended into the shared legroom. A flight attendant had tried once, politely, to clarify seat assignments. Victoria simply smiled, waved a manicured hand, and said sweetly, "It's a long flight. I'm sure they can accommodate the other guest elsewhere." Now, as final boarding was called, the last few passengers began making their way down the jet bridge. One of them moved differently. A tall black man in a Navy Tom Ford suit stepped forward with the unhurried composure of someone who knew exactly when to arrive. His leather briefcase gleamed faintly under the terminal lights, not flashy, but refined. Damon Washington didn't scan the room in search of attention. His eyes moved with precision, not urgency. A few passengers looked up, brows furrowed in vague recognition. A whisper passed between two venture capitalists near the front. "Is that him?" One murmured. "Looks like it." The other replied, "That's Damon Washington." He nodded courteously to the lead flight attendant and stepped into the cabin. His gaze settled on the seat marker above Wani. His seat, and a lavender blanket sprawled across it. The woman occupying both chairs didn't notice. She was too busy adjusting her recline with one hand and sipping cucumber water with the other. Damon stopped, calm as a still tide, and simply said, "Excuse me, I believe this is my seat." Victoria finally glanced up, her oversized sunglasses slipping just enough to reveal a smirk. Her eyes moved slowly, from his polished shoes to his precisely tailored lapels, then back to his face. "Oh," she said with faux surprise, her tone light but condescending. "You must be mistaken. This row's already occupied." Damon calmly held up his boarding pass. "One," he printed clearly. Victoria barely acknowledged it. She gestured loosely behind them. "I'm sure they can find you something else. It's just one row. I really need to rest. I have sensitive joints. It's a long flight, you understand." Her voice remained syrupy sweet, but her eyes no longer smiled. Damon didn't budge. "I'll need my seat," he said evenly. Victoria's smile sharpened. "I'm flying overnight. I require space. And honestly, I think it would be best for everyone, yourself included, if you found somewhere else to sit." Damon raised a single brow. "My ticket is for one." Victoria sighed theatrically. "Look, I'm not trying to be difficult, but there are environments that work better for different kinds of travelers." Damon didn't respond. He just looked at her, expression unreadable. Victoria leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's just that people like me, we're used to a certain standard." The air between them grew heavier. A hush began to ripple through the cabin. Some passengers turned subtly, watching. Some lifted their phones, screens angled discreetly. A moment later, a flight attendant stepped in. "Ma'am," she said gently, "we do need all guests to sit in their assigned seats." Victoria turned to her, smile now tight. "I already explained. I'm using both seats for medical reasons. You can sit in business class, or speak to the desk." The flight attendant glanced at Damon's boarding pass. Her eyes widened slightly. She hesitated. "Sir, if you'll wait just a moment, we'll sort this," she said, careful. Damon nodded once, and turned back toward Victoria. "You're in my seat." That's when Victoria's tone changed. "And you're making me deeply uncomfortable," she snapped. "I don't feel safe." She looked straight at the attendant. "I don't feel safe with him standing over me like this." Damon didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed just slightly. The attendant shifted uncomfortably. Around them, the tension had begun to thicken. Passengers exchanging glances, fingers quietly tapping record buttons. Victoria sniffed once, dramatically, then turned her face toward the window, as if to shut the scene out. Within a minute, the purser arrived. Marcus Line, calm and practiced. He leaned into Damon, speaking quietly. "Mr. Washington, I understand this is your assigned seat. Would you mind stepping into the galley while we resolve the situation? Just a moment." Damon remained still for a beat. Then, with the same calm he carried in, he nodded once and walked away, his briefcase still in hand. Victoria exhaled in triumph, curling deeper into her blanket. "Some people," she muttered just loud enough, "don't understand boundaries." What she didn't realize, what no one yet realized, was that Damon Washington wasn't just another executive passenger. He was the man who built the airline, and in exactly 7 minutes, the skies above them would start shifting in his favor. Damon stepped into the galley with quiet precision. The cool-toned overhead lights reflected off the stainless steel around him, casting the space in a soft, clinical calm. Behind him, the whispers from the cabin swirled like rising smoke. Curious, cautious, recorded. Through the oval window in the door, he could still see the edge of seat 1E. His seat, still buried beneath Victoria Sterling's lavender kingdom of blankets, pillows, and entitlement. The flight attendant beside him fidgeted nervously, fingers pulling at her blazer hem. Marcus offered a tight, professional smile. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Washington," he said. Damon gave a brief nod. "Take your time." He wasn't scrolling, wasn't calling, just checking the time. 6 a.m. He gave them until 7:04, and that was generous. Back in the cabin, Victoria reclined even further, clearly emboldened. A man too rose back, leaned toward his neighbor, and whispered, "That's Damon Washington, CEO of Vanguard Aero. They own Skylure." The neighbor's eyes widened. Outside, the jet bridge sealed with a thud, and inside, the clock had already started ticking. Damon stood in the galley, his posture composed, his breath steady. Around him, the hum of the aircraft systems blended with hushed murmurs drifting in from the cabin. He didn't shift, didn't pace, just stood, thumb lightly resting on the edge of his phone. Through the narrow window in the door, he could still see the back corner of seat 1E. The lavender blanket hadn't moved, the pillow still perched defiantly on his headrest. And Victoria Sterling, she looked positively victorious, reclined, relaxed, and clueless. Chloe Grant, the flight attendant who tried to intervene earlier, stood beside him, fingers still nervously adjusting her uniform cuff. Marcus Line gave Damon another tight-lipped smile. "We're working on it," he said. Damon nodded politely, then glanced down at his phone. Not to text, not to scroll, just to check the time. 6 a.m. He gave them until 7:04. Back in the cabin, passengers whispered behind coffee cups. Phones were tilted subtly into record mode. And in 3B, a man leaned to his neighbor, whispering, "That's him. That's the guy who owns the airline." His neighbor's eyes widened. "You're kidding." "Not at all," the man replied. "That's Damon Washington." While the rest of the cabin simmered with curiosity, Marcus leaned in closer to Chloe near the galley curtain. "He's being calm," he murmured, "but we're sitting on a lit fuse." Chloe gave the smallest nod. She won't budge. Keeps insisting she feels unsafe. Marcus exhaled. Classic playbook. In the cockpit, Captain Elias Ward had already been informed. His co-pilot watched him scroll through the crew management tablet with a frown. "Tell me it's nothing," Ward muttered. The co-pilot shrugged. "One of the passengers is live streaming. Could go viral any minute." Ward set the tablet down. "We're holding cold engines. We don't move until this is resolved." At the gate, boarding was closed. Last-minute passengers were turned away with gentle apologies and plastic smiles. But the ground crew could feel it. Something was wrong. Inside the galley, Damon remained motionless. At 7:03, Chloe returned to him again. "Mr. Washington," she said carefully, "we've reviewed the manifest. Your seat is valid. Your boarding is fully confirmed." Damon didn't blink. Chloe continued, "But Ms. Sterling is invoking a medical exception. She claims sensitive joints and has requested accommodation." Damon finally turned fully toward her. His voice was quiet. "Miss Grant, how many times today have you seen a passenger take over 2 first-class seats using a pillow and blanket set?" Chloe opened her mouth, hesitated, then answered honestly. "Once," she said quietly. Damon nodded. "And how many times has that person said the words, 'people like me'?" Her lips pressed together. "Exactly once," she admitted. Without raising his voice, Damon stepped back, lifted his phone, and tapped a small silver button on the corner of the case. A subtle haptic buzz confirmed the signal. No words, no commands, just one quiet gesture. Nearly 2,000 miles away, in the Vanguard Aero Command Center in Chicago, Ariel Monroe looked up from her console. A notification blinked on screen. "Protocol Raven, initiated." She straightened. "We're live," she said. Around her, engineers and analysts snapped to attention. One pulled up the passenger manifest. Another brought up real-time telemetry. A third flipped open a thick protocol binder. Phase 1 confirmed, an operator said. "Observation sweep initiated." "Stand by," Ariel replied. "No public interference. Internal comms only. Surveillance mode. Back on flight 1870. Damon's phone vibrated once in response. He allowed himself the faintest smile. The lavender blanket still blanketed both seats. Victoria shifted her legs, adjusting her recline. She still believed she'd won. And Damon, he quietly put his phone away. The storm had already begun. Victoria, meanwhile, had begun speaking again, this time not to anyone in particular, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I don't mean to sound rude," she said, adjusting a blanket with deliberate poise. "But sometimes certain people get the wrong impression. First class exists for a reason." Across the aisle, a businessman in a charcoal blazer gave a quiet snort. Victoria turned, momentarily stunned that anyone would challenge her. "There should be standards," she added firmly. Just then, Chloe crouched beside her seat, voice even. "Ma'am, I need to inform you. The gentleman you're referring to holds a valid boarding pass for seat 1. Victoria's expression hardened. "You mean the man who threatened me?" Chloe stayed composed. "No threats were recorded. We've reviewed everything." A few passengers now stared openly. Phones remained raised. Victoria looked around, searching for support, but found only hesitation. "This is harassment," she snapped. "I know people on your board." Chloe stood, hands folded. "We're working with corporate. Please remain calm." Victoria crossed her arms. "If I feel unsafe, you're liable. My attorneys will be involved." At that moment, Damon stepped back into the cabin. The blanket was still there. So was the silence. And the center of gravity had just shifted. Chloe made down one's eyes. She didn't speak, but the message passed between them. "We're trying. We're late. We're out of time. We need a few more minutes," she said quietly. "The captain's been informed. Please wait by the jet bridge." Damon didn't argue. He nodded once, turned, and walked up the aisle. Behind him, the door sealed shut with a low hiss. 7 minutes had passed since Victoria Sterling refused to move. 7 minutes since she chose entitlement over empathy. And now the sky was beginning to shift. Out on the jet bridge, the air was cooler still. Damon adjusted the strap of his briefcase and checked his phone. One vibration. Phase 2. Authorized. Inside Vanguard Aero HQ, Ariel Monroe stood before a massive live operations display. "Hold Phase 2, she said. "Observe crew behavior profile. Monitor internal comms for escalation. No outward disruption. Yet." Engineers ran cinnamon algorithms, scanning crew logs, tone escalations, keyword spikes. The word unsafe was already trending. Ariel took a slow sip of coffee. "Prepare latency inserts," she added. "JFK, LAX, and Houston. Just enough to create friction." Across the country, Skylar boarding gates began to glitch. Harmless at first, but something subtle, precise, and unstoppable had just taken root. Back in the galley, Chloe and Marcus whispered in tight tones. The cabin had gone strangely quiet. Victoria still lounged across both seats, one leg tucked beneath her blanket, the other stretched over the extended footrest. She scrolled idly through her phone, but her jaw had tightened. Her composure was slipping. The mood had shifted, and she could feel it. Phones were no longer discreet. A man across the aisle aimed his camera without shame. A woman in 3D furiously typed into a Twitter thread. Victoria turned to Chloe as she passed and whispered, "Has he left?" Chloe didn't stop walking. "He's complying, ma'am, but he hasn't left the flight. I demand to know what's being done," Victoria said sharply. "I've never felt more targeted. I've flown Skylure for years." Chloe nodded, lips pressed. She didn't respond, because she had seen it, the small, ultra-exec corporate tag attached to Damon's boarding pass. A tag only issued to people within the Vanguard Aero Group's leadership tier. He wasn't just a premium traveler. He was the owner, and a man Victoria had just accused of threatening her was the one person no one on this airline had authority over. Not anymore. In the cockpit, Captain Elias Ward stared at his crew operations dashboard. The usual green indicators had begun flickering amber. Crew scheduling was desynchronized. Automated safety checklists stalled halfway. Nothing was broken, yet, but everything was delayed. "Still nothing from command?" he asked, pressing his headset closer. His co-pilot shook her head. "Intercom's lagging. Boarding gates are stuttering too. Feels like a soft systems choke." Ward rubbed his forehead. "We're not pushing back. Not until we hear from ops directly." Back at the gate, Ground agents wore plastic smiles while quietly diverting latecomers. Boarding was sealed. Inside the cabin, Damon remained just outside the door, his phone in hand. The vibration came precisely at 7:04. Phase 2. Authorize on-demand hold. He didn't speak. Just type one word. Stand by. In Chicago, Ariel Monroe saw the ping light up. Flag Regulus, she ordered. Run response lag checks at all domestic Skylar nodes. Start soft. 2-second delays. Scale in 5-minute increments. Technicians began stalling boarding confirmation flows. Not crashing anything. Just enough to grind the edges. Damon didn't need headlines. He didn't need confrontation. He only needed time. And Victoria Sterling had just bought him all of it. At gate 6A, 2 men in trim gray suits approached the desk and quietly flashed internal security credentials. Brian Okoro, VP of Corporate Risk, one said, "Where is Mr. Washington?" The gate agent blinked. He stepped out to the jet bridge. Brian didn't waste another second. Opened the cabin door. Quietly, inside, Victoria glanced toward the front of the aircraft, where Chloe now stood frozen. Her crew tablet had just flashed a quiet message. Exec presence confirmed. Do not engage further. Prepare transfer. Victoria stood abruptly, her voice pitched for drama. "I want to speak to the captain," she announced. Marcus Lyons stepped in smoothly. "You'll need to return to your seat, ma'am." "No, I'm being attacked here. This airline has failed to protect me. I want a formal report filed now." Marcus met her eyes flat. "It's already been logged." For the first time, something in Victoria's tone wavered. The calm condescension faded. The whispers around her had changed texture. Less curious, more aware. Behind her, passengers had stopped pretending not to listen. The camera phones weren't just aimed anymore. They were recording history, and Victoria was no longer in control of the narrative. Just then, Damon stepped through the cabin door, followed closely by Brian Okoro. The air seemed to shift. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Victoria spun around. "Excuse me, but Brian raised a hand calmly. "Miss Sterling, please return to your seat." "I will not return, ma'am," he said, voice still low, but final. Something about his tone made her stop. She turned slowly, almost mechanical, and sank into 1D without another word. Damon didn't look at her. He turned to Marcus and Chloe instead. "I'll be in seat 1, he said simply. "Please clear the second seat." Chloe nodded. She stepped forward and quietly folded the lavender blanket. The silk pillow disappeared into the overhead bin. Victoria said nothing, didn't blink. Her posture stiffened, her hands clenched in her lap. Around them, the atmosphere shifted again. More than awkwardness now. It was awareness. Passengers leaned back, whispering to one another. Some tweeted, some just stared. The man she tried to erase with a blanket had just returned and taken a seat like it was always his. Because it was. And the rest of the world was finally catching up to that fact. But Ariel Monroe wasn't done. Back at Vanguard Aero HQ, her team had begun injecting Phase 2 latency across Skylure's national network. In 7 other major airports, boarding pass scanners started to hang mid-swipe. Crew tablets froze and rebooted. Seat maps reloaded without warning. Nothing catastrophic yet. Just noise. Just pressure. Chloe received a new alert on her tablet. Do not proceed with pushback. Await executive confirmation. She walked to the cockpit. "Captain," she said quietly, "we're on a corporate hold." Word didn't need to ask why. "Understood," he replied. Moments later, a voice called from 2A. "Are we delayed? The screen says we should have left 15 minutes ago." Marcus stepped into the aisle, his tone calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a minor systems delay and are awaiting final clearance. We appreciate your patience." From across the aisle, Victoria leaned toward Damon and hissed, "So you think you've won?" Damon didn't look at her. "I'm not here for that. People like you," she muttered, "always find a way to manipulate things. You sit down and the world rearranges itself." He turned slightly. "No," he said, "the world already has. Some people are just slow to notice." Victoria scoffed, her jaw tightening. "I'll be making some calls. Let's see how smug you look when my attorneys get involved." Damon didn't move. "Please do. Outside, two more executives from Skylar's corporate office arrive at the gate. Noah Delgado, VP of Operations, and a senior HR compliance officer. Brian Okoro met them just beyond the jet bridge. He's taken a seat, Brian said plainly. She's been diffused for now. But this isn't about de-escalation anymore. It's about precedent. Inside the cabin, Chloe leaned close to Marcus. Passengers are starting to murmur. He nodded. We've held them too long. They'll demand answers. In row 3, a passenger stood. Excuse me, are we going to be allowed to deplane? Another voice chimed in. Is someone sick? Is it a mechanical problem? The tension thickened. Victoria seized the moment. She stood abruptly, pointing toward Damon. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's time someone told the truth. This man has created a situation that's delaying all of us. Chloe stepped forward fast. Ma'am, please return to your seat. No, Victoria raised her voice. He harassed me. The crew won't act because he's an executive. Before Chloe could intervene again, the man in 3A stood up. I've been watching since she threw a blanket over both seats, he said clearly. She's the one who created this. A woman in 2F added, you literally told him to go sit and coach. We all heard you. Victoria flushed red. You weren't involved. This has nothing to do with you. A voice from the back row rang out. It does now. You're making all of us late. The cabin erupted. Not in panic, but with clarity. Voices raised in agreement. Phones recording openly now. Hashtags were being born in real time. And Damon Washington, he sat still, silent, hands resting on his briefcase like nothing around him concerned him at all. At the cockpit threshold, Captain Ward stepped out, his voice firm. That's enough. The cabin fell quiet instantly. He pointed directly at Victoria. Take your seat. She stood frozen for a beat, then obeyed. Chloe met Damon's, eyes across the aisle. Her mouth barely moved. We'll sort this. He gave a small nod. In Chicago, Ariel Monroe reviewed the alert on her screen. Flight 1870. Passenger-led escalation. Video captured. Recommend. Stage 3. Approved, she said. Let the pressure build. Back at Vanguard Aero headquarters, Ariel Monroe stood before the live systems board, watching the ripple effect spread. 8 major airports now reported boarding slowdowns. Internal comms flagged increased latency, seat assignment errors, and spontaneous gate reassignments. But none of it could be traced to a single failure point. It was deliberate, measured disruption without alarm. Ariel turned to her team. Initiate full phase 2, she instructed. No more observation. 10-minute saturation across all Skylar nodes. Engineers got to work. Add 3-point checkpoints to cross-verify passenger tags, she added. Target only Skylar flights. Let the world feel it through us. Across the country, boarding scanners blinked out of sync. Tablets rebooted mid-check. Passengers were told, sorry, systems refreshing. They never knew what was really happening. Back on flight 1870, Chloe received a new directive on her tablet. Red, blinking, unmistakable. Do not proceed with pushback. Await executive confirmation. She approached Captain Ward. He read the screen, then exhaled. We're locked down. A passenger called out. Are we seriously delayed now? Marcus responded with practiced calm. We're awaiting final clearance from operations. Victoria leaned toward Damon, her voice a hiss. So this is all because of you? Damon didn't respond. He didn't have to. Victoria narrowed her eyes. You think this proves something? Damon finally turned toward her. I'm not proving anything. You're revealing everything. She scoffed, trying to recover ground. I know people on Skylar's advisory board. You're not untouchable. He met her gaze, calm and unflinching. That may be, but you're not invisible. Around them, the temperature of the cabin had shifted completely. Passengers were alert, watching, listening. The delay had passed 45 minutes. In row 2, a man flagged Chloe. This is bordering on unlawful. Are we going to be allowed to deplane? Another passenger called out. Are we being held because of her? Victoria's head whipped around. Excuse me, you don't know what you're talking about. But this time, no one recoiled. No one defended her. The crew stayed quiet. The passengers didn't. Chloe's tablet pinged again. She read the new directive, showed it to Marcus. They exchanged a silent look. Moments later, all 4 flight attendants were summoned to the galley. Marcus read the message aloud. All crew are to prepare for cabin exit. Operational leadership will reboard with replacement crew once stabilization is confirmed. Chloe blinked. We're leaving the plane. Marcus nodded. That's what they want. Captain Ward's voice came calmly over the speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, in accordance with corporate operational review, the current flight crew will temporarily disembark. We ask that you remain in your seats as we coordinate internal adjustments. Thank you for your patience. The cabin fell into stunned silence, then disbelief. Passengers turned to one another, blinking, whispering. Victoria stood abruptly, pointing again at Damon. You can't be serious. This is because of him, isn't it? They're doing all this for one man. From row 4, a younger woman replied sharply, no. They're doing it because of you. The words landed like a slap. Victoria froze. Her eyes darted toward Damon, searching his expression, but he offered nothing, just stillness. One by one, the flight attendants gathered their bags and made their way to the cabin door. Some passengers recorded, others just watched, absorbing the gravity of what was happening. At the terminal entrance, Brian Okoro waited with a quiet message from Ariel Monroe. Phase 3 complete. Command authority transferred to Washington. Brian stepped into the aircraft and approached Damon. Mr. Washington, your authority is now recognized. Full board alignment. Compliance signed off. Damon rose slowly, adjusted a jacket cuffs, and replied, then let's finish this. Inside Vanguard's ops center, Ariel didn't pause. Pull full audit logs on Skylar's VIP handling policies. I want a full history on Victoria Sterling's flight record. If there's a pattern, surface it. A compliance tech already had it. Flagged incidents in 2021 and 2022, both involving preferential treatment and complaints from other passengers. Ariel didn't even blink. Brand liability in motion. Begin internal report. Back on the plane, Victoria had regained just enough nerve to rise again. I want answers, she said, voice trembling. Damon stepped forward. You'll get them. So will everyone else. Do you feel powerful now? She sneered. Damon shook his head. No, I feel responsible. The cabin remained still. Tension tight, but under control. Reporters had begun arriving outside the terminal windows. Cameras scanned every gate. Hashtags were already trending. Hashtag Seat 1E. Hashtag Fly with Dignity. Hashtag Damon Washington Effect. Passengers around Damon whispered. A man in 5C muttered, we had the guy who built this airline sitting right here. Victoria sat now in stiff silence, her once commanding posture replaced by rigid defensiveness. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence, once a tool of superiority, had now become her undoing. The power had shifted, and the cabin knew it. Captain Ward stared at his dashboard. The pre-departure clearance had stalled entirely. Crew rotation data was distinct. The intercom link to gate control spun endlessly. He pressed his headset closer. Noah, if you're there, give me something. In the executive briefing room, Noah Delgado rubbed his temple while fielding calls. Tell Ward he's not going anywhere, he told his team. No taxi, no pushback, not until we hear from Washington directly. Back in the cabin, Victoria fidgeted. Her fingers tapped against her phone screen. No reception. The Wi-Fi had dropped again. Earlier attempts to call her attorney had failed. Damon remained silent beside her. She leaned in with a hiss. What are you trying to prove? Damon didn't flinch. Nothing. You're doing that on your own. You think everyone should bow to you just because you're important, she snapped. He turned his head slightly, voice measured. Everyone should be treated with basic dignity. That includes you. Her jaw tightened. I know people, she whispered, and I will use every connection I have. Damon met her stare. Then you should have started with respect, because every seat has eyes now, and every word is being archived. Victoria's breath caught. Who are you really? She asked, her voice quieter now. Because you sure act like you run this place. Damon stood slowly, his tone even. I helped build this place. The words landed like thunder. Around them, The cabin seemed to lean in. Phones lifted. Passengers sat straighter. Brian Okoro stepped forward, confirming quietly, "This is Damon Washington, co-founder and silent board member of Vanguard Aero Group, parent company of Skylure Airways." The ripple was instant. Gasps. Murmurs. Phone screens lighting up. Victoria stumbled backward into her seat, stunned into silence. At Vanguard HQ, the media team finalized the first public statement. No names yet, just a soft acknowledgement of the disruption and a reaffirmation of dignity standards. Ariel made the call. "Don't say his name. Let the public discover it themselves. It'll carry more weight that way." Back in 1E, Damon retook a seat. Around him, passengers whispered, now with reverence. A few search him online. Press photos. Board meeting clips. It was all real. One man in 5C whispered, "We had a literal architect of the skies right here." And beside him, Victoria, once loud, now silent, had finally realized the seat she tried to claim had never belonged to her. The passengers had stopped whispering. For a moment, all eyes were on Damon Washington, no longer a mystery, no longer anonymous. His presence now felt like gravity, undeniable, steady, and centered. The old crew was gone. The new one had yet to board, and in that gap, the cabin held its breath. Victoria Sterling sat in 1D, arms folded tightly, jaw set. Her confidence had collapsed inward. She avoided everyone's gaze. The lavender blanket that once marked her claimed territory now lay folded in the overhead bin. Silk, quiet, defeated. Damon didn't gloat. He simply sat, composed, grounded. His tablet buzzed once. He opened it. A secure Vanguard satellite link came online. 5 live feeds popped up instantly. Legal, public relations, logistics, real-time social sentiment, and command escalation. Ariel Monroe appeared on screen in one of them. "We're trending in every major metro," she reported. "Business leaders, civil rights groups, and even competitors are chiming in." Damon nodded. "Issue the first statement. Keep it measured. Dignity and equity only. No names." "Understood." As Ariel coordinated, Damon turned off the screen. This moment didn't belong to him. It belonged to every passenger who had ever been made to feel small. Until now, around the cabin, conversations resumed. Quiet first, but gaining confidence. A man in 4D leaned toward the young woman beside him. "He hasn't said who he is," he whispered. She smiled faintly. "He doesn't have to." At the front of the plane, Victoria stood again, her voice brittle. "I want off this flight. Now, this is a violation of my rights." She stormed toward the galley. Brian Okoro intercepted her calmly. "Ma'am, your request has been logged. However, we're currently under a restricted movement protocol. No one is allowed to deplane without clearance." "This is outrageous," she snapped. "You think you can treat me like some criminal? I'll sue this airline into the ground." Damon finally stood. His tone was even. "You're free to pursue legal action, Miss Sterling, but I suggest you remember, every seat has eyes now, and every word you say is already archived." Victoria froze, fury trembling in her hands. "Who are you really?" she whispered. Damon's answer was simple. "I helped build this place." Silence again. The weight of his presence was no longer symbolic. It was operational. It was systemic. And the balance of power had fully, irreversibly shifted. Moments later, a voice came over the cabin speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Interim Flight Operations Officer Brian Okoro. Due to procedural restructuring, your flight will now proceed under direct oversight. Please remain calm and seated. Further instructions will follow shortly." Victoria let a sharp laugh. "What is this? Some kind of military operation?" A middle-aged woman across the aisle turned toward her. "Ma'am," she said gently, "you've said enough." Victoria blinked, visibly startled. "Excuse me," but no one responded. She was isolated now, no longer the voice of authority, just another passenger with too much to say and no one willing to listen. Damon powered on his tablet again. The satellite system had restored partial connectivity. Real-time analytics flooded in. Hashtags were still rising. Hashtag Seat1E, Hashtag fly with dignity. Hashtag Damon Washington effect. He scanned cinnamon dashboards, media inquiries, legal notices. Ariel's voice crackled in. Shall we initiate the full public statement? Damon paused, then shook his head. Not yet. Let the story breathe. Let the public uncover it on their own. It'll carry more weight that way. Outside, camera crews waited behind glass. But inside, Damon didn't move. The revolution had already taken flight, without a single raised voice. A young boy across the aisle turned to Damon. "Mister, are you the boss of the airplane?" Damon offered a gentle smile. Something like that. His mother looked horrified. "I'm so sorry. He's just..." Damon raised a hand. "It's all right. Sometimes the truth sounds best from children." The engine's power back on. Systems resensed. The plane began to push back from the gate. Outside, media vans gathered near the terminal. But what had taken off wasn't just a plane, it was a reckoning. 30 minutes into the air, the tension had thinned, but the awareness had not. Passengers whispered his name now, not with fear, but with awe. Victoria Sterling, once sprawled across 2 seats like royalty, now sat rigid in 1D. Her silence remained, but had lost all its power. Damon spent the next hour monitoring internal dashboards, but he wasn't watching for applause. He was watching for follow-through. In Chicago, Ariel Monroe was already briefing the board. "The dignity policy is trending as a national standard," she said. "Competitors are already responding. Phoenix Jet is matching the score system. Skylinks has suspended all premium upgrades pending fairness review." A new culture wasn't just forming, it was catching. In Washington, the Department of Transportation scheduled a hearing. Damon was invited to testify before a congressional committee, not just about Flight 1870, but about whether dignity metrics could become national aviation standards. He accepted. The hearing was tense. Cameras rolled. Lawmakers argued. One senator warned, "This bill will over-regulate the industry and hurt profitability." But another, holding up a printout of a tweet showing the empty seat in 1E, stood firmly. "Profit without respect," she said, "is theft in a necktie." Damon's testimony was brief, but devastating. "We're not punishing bad apples," he said. "We're building a better orchard." Outside the chamber, crowds had gathered. Protesters, supporters, former flight attendants, parents, veterans. Signs waved. "We remember seat 1E. Dignity isn't a luxury." Past the framework, reporters surged toward Damon as he exited the building. One asked, "Do you think it will pass?" Damon looked in the camera and answered plainly, "I believe people remember how they were treated, and they vote accordingly." Back at Vanguard, Ariel reviewed polling data. Public opinion had swung dramatically. Voters weren't asking for first class, they were asking for first principles. And Damon had just reminded them what those looked like in action. 2 days later, the vote passed, 58-42. The passenger dignity framework became law. Outside the Capitol, cheers erupted. Hugs, tears. A chant began. "Dignity flies first." Damon didn't celebrate. He returned to Vanguard and called a full staff meeting. "We didn't create the law," he said. "We reminded them of their humanity. Now we lead by example." He unveiled the Passenger Dignity Index, an open-access platform where travelers could rate their experiences across all airlines. Real transparency, real accountability. Vanguard submitted every flight. Other airlines scrambled. Some imitated. Some resisted. But change was no longer a question. It was a current. Months passed. Damon turned down awards, declined interviews. Flew coach, always rode 12. Chloe Grant launched a nonprofit for flight crew culture reform. Ariel co-authored a policy paper adopted into university curriculums. As for Victoria Sterling, her lawsuit failed. Her reputation faded. Her silence endured. 1 year later, a bronze seat marked 1E was installed at the National Museum of Transportation Reform. Below it, a plaque read, "One man didn't move, and a world did instead." Damon visited once alone. He placed a folded boarding pass on the seat, then turned and walked quietly into the next flight.